Welcome back, everyone. Now that you know what an evaluation study is, we're going to discuss the different types of evaluation research studies that are conducted. Evaluation research is broken up into two main subgroups: formative evaluations and summative evaluations. Formative evaluations occur either before or during the program's implementation, whereas summative evaluations are conducted after the program is over. Let's start by discussing the two formative evaluations, needs assessments and process evaluation, more in depth. Needs assessments are probably one of the most important but most neglected types of evaluation research studies. A needs assessment is an exploratory study that is done before a program or policy is put into place. The whole point of a needs assessment is to identify the needs of a particular population or location of interest. Say, for example, that there's a neighborhood in Tyler that has a high rate of vehicle break-ins compared to the surrounding city. We could just put in place a program that increases the police presence or limits entry to the neighborhood, but how do we know that these will work? If we were to do a needs assessment, then researchers would go into the neighborhood and talk to the residents, see what life is like inside the neighborhood. Why do the neighbors think the cars are getting broken into? What solution do the neighbors want? What solution do the neighbors not want? This information is an important starting line for creating a successful program implementation. But, like I said, most neglected, right? The problem is that oftentimes programs are started from the top, based on data patterns and public support, and they may not always have as strong a basis in the population needs as they should. Protests or community organizations can often increase the pressure to do something right then. And so oftentimes we have policies that are put into place that are not fully fleshed out before they're being implemented. What is more common and still helpful is the process evaluation. The process evaluation is done while the program or policy is being put into place in order to determine how implementation compared between expected and reality. Process evaluations are focused on the specific mechanics of the program, things like the administration of the program, the subject recruitment, the passing of information, etc. I know this graphic is small, but the yellow represents the inputs to the program: money, partners, support, staff, etc. The process output looks at how many of those outputs were provided, how many of those inputs were provided, and then also how those resources were then used to create products during the program. Was there enough staff to run the small groups that were requested? Did participants show up to the meetings like they were supposed to? Oftentimes when a program is put into place, it will require alterations or modifications from the original design. So maybe they planned to staff the prison vocational program with 5 people, but then COVID-19 hit and they had to cut 2 of the staff and they moved 2 of the others to virtual interaction only. That type of modification would be documented in a process evaluation, along with findings about how the impact of those modifications and then recommendations for the future. My very first evaluation study that I participated in was during my PhD program. I was assigned to a process evaluation project with the Nebraska State Parole Agency to evaluate a new sex offender step-down program. The year before, Nebraska policymakers had passed a law mandating that all parolees who were convicted of sexual offenses be supervised at intensive levels, no matter what their actual risk of recidivism was. The problem with this law was that it carried no funding. And all of a sudden, the parole office had over 150 parolees that were suddenly moved to intensive supervision, but they weren't given any money for additional parole officers or additional resources. So what parole had to then do was create a program that would step these parolees back down to a lower, more manageable supervision level. But they needed one that still ensured public safety was protected. So they created the step-down program. The goal was that offenders would go through a series of polygraphs and parole check-ins, and then they would be stepped down in supervision levels until they got to a supervision level that was appropriate to their recidivism risk. Basically, they needed a way to undo the legislation because they didn't have the resources to do what the legislators had designed. So I came into this project and they're trying to recruit parolees to participate. Here's the problem. The first step of the program was a sexual history disclosure polygraph. This is a polygraph test where the participant has to list and describe every sexual encounter they have ever had in their entire lives. Now, some of these parolees were 50, 60, maybe even older. They needed to write down the name of every partner, the location of the sexual interaction, the type of sexual act, and the time of the sex act and the type of the sexual acts completed, all under the threat of a polygraph. So obviously, not a lot of parolees were jumping up for a chance to participate. So about a year goes by in the program, and they have finally managed to recruit 8 participants. They quickly run into their first major problem. The second or third person who completes the sexual history disclosure polygraph indicates on the disclosure form that he had sexual intercourse with an unknown female in the bathroom of an airport. He stated that he wasn't sure of their age, that they could have been under the age of 18 at the time, but he didn't know for sure. And here's the biggest issue. He stated that both occurrences of this happened back in the 1970s. Okay, so now we've run into an implementation concern that nobody is prepared for. This could be a potential sexual assault, but it's outside of the statute of limitations, and of course there is literally no way in the world to investigate this. So what do? This stalled the program for a bit while the administrators tried to decide what to do next. They finally decided to report the offense to the state police and then to remove the parolee from the step-down program. Well, word immediately went around about that, and all of a sudden nobody wanted to take the polygraph test. So when I was writing up reports for the agency, I had to address this implementation issue, and then I recommended that future programs have a clear policy in place before starting that addresses what happens in the event of an undisclosed crime. I also talked about the impact of this event on the recruitment strategy and why this caused the program participation to suffer. This is what a process evaluation can help us do. Make the program better next time. Okay, so now let's look at the summative evaluations. Both of these are conducted after a program or policy is implemented and a set period of time has passed. An outcome evaluation is a targeted summative evaluation that focuses solely on the effectiveness of the program or policy on the target population. I've highlighted this here because it's important to distinguish this when we talked about an impact evaluation in a second. An outcome evaluation will look at both the short-term and the long-term impacts of the program on participants. The goal of an outcome evaluation is to determine whether or not the program is doing what it was designed to do. Generally, outcome evaluations will include a quantitative component, although they may also use mixed methods. But we do see more statistical analyses in outcome evaluations as compared to the 2 formative evaluation designs that we discussed previously. Now, an outcome evaluation is very limited. So generally, you're going to see what your textbook calls an impact evaluation. This is a more comprehensive look at the outcomes of a program that looks beyond just the intended effect and beyond just the intended target. Impact evaluations will ask whether or not the program achieved its goals, but they'll also look at whether the program had unintended consequences for people in the program, people who were working the program, and people outside of the program entirely. So maybe that free lunch program caused a raise in local taxes for the neighborhoods nearby, an unintended consequence that was not part of the designed impact of the free lunch program. An impact evaluation would report these types of consequences, which are also called collateral consequences, that occur as a result of the program even without intent. An impact evaluation can provide a very important recommendation to policymakers because it can identify whether or not the program achieved its goals and what the overall impact of that program was to multiple involved parties. Thus, a researcher can conclude that the program should be continued without modification, modified in some way but still continued, or terminated altogether. All right, well, that concludes part 2 of our evaluation research lecture. Join me in the final lecture video of the course as we discuss the challenges of evaluation research.